Hello. In 1879, the 22-year-old 6th Duke of Portland inherited Welbeck Abbey. The new Duke was horrified by the house as left by the burrowing Duke, describing it as a white elephant and inconvenient barracks. He wished to turn his back on it, but his stepmother insisted he should live in the house and make it the center of his social life. He obeyed. He stayed. We see from this early photograph that the building has enlarged and improved by the burrowing Duke, standing in great expanses of mown grass, was bleakly forbidding. Note the iron balconies, iron staircases leading down from the piano nobile, the iron fences and balustrades, all perhaps inspired by the grand hotels of Scarborough and Brighton. 10 years later, the Duke married Winifred Anna Dallas-Yorke of Walmsgate Hall near Louth in Lincolnshire. This portrait by Christian Meyer Ross was painted in Rome in 1884, 5 years before her marriage. No doubt influenced by Duchess Winifred and her mother, Frances Graham, who had a strong interest in the arts and crafts movement, improvements to the abbey began immediately, led by arts and crafts architect-craftsmen John Sedding and Henry Wilson. These works were to continue until 1913. A turning point was fire in the Oxford wing in 1900. That's the section of the house on the left of the photograph. It was an opportunity for some radical alterations to the house, including improvements to internal circulation and a grand new classical facade for the east front, behind which the principal staterooms lie. With the family once more in residence at the repaired abbey, attention could be given to gardens surrounding the house, and a number of garden advisors and designers were called in. This period coincides with a great development in photography, the Lumiere brothers' invention of the autochrome direct color photographic process. This process was patented in 1903 and introduced commercially in 1907. In the process, a panchromatic black and white photographic emulsion on a glass plate is exposed through a microscopic mosaic of potato starch grains dyed red, blue, and green. The black and white image serves as a color selection filter, and a developed autochrome plate, viewed by transmitted light, will be seen in full and splendid color. By another fortunate coincidence, the Retford businessman Stephen Pegler took early retirement and thereafter devoted much of his time to photography, especially stereoscopic photography using the autochrome process. He was actually related to the Rothschild family, and as Uncle Stephen sometimes worked with Lionel the Rothschild, now famed as an enthusiastic user of the autochrome process. To Stephen Pegler, we owe the Portland Collection set of 50 pairs of stereoscopic autochrome plates showing the Welbeck Abbey flower gardens from about 1910 until 1928, all housed in a taxiphote, a stereoscopic autochrome viewing machine. The photographs which follow are all Pegler's work, digitally photographed and restored. We can now move through the seasons in a great Edwardian garden in which horticultural skill was extraordinarily highly developed and all necessary labor easily available. In the campaign of developing the Abbey Gardens, the strongest influence appears to have been the partnership of Alfred Parsons of Walter, Crocus, and Ives Partridge, commissioned to advise on the gardens by the 6th Duke. Alfred Parsons was a landscape painter and botanical illustrator. He's best remembered today for his watercolors of roses painted for Ellen Wilmot's famous book, The Genus Rosa. We do not know how far his designs were adopted, but the east terraces were laid out with formal parterres, gravel paths, clipped box edging, blocks of trimmed yews, clipped pyramidal hollies. The centerpiece of the arrangement is a pool with a fountain, topped with a figure of a small girl, modeled on the young Lady Victoria, Duchess Winifred's daughter, and she is riding a swan. The sculptor Alphonse Legros, French-born but naturalized Englishman, taught at the Slade School, where notable for teaching a large group of distinguished women artists who became known as the Slade Girls. His work on the two fountains for the 6th Duke of Portland was done after his retirement from the Slade. Now, the planting is notably not gardenesque or Victorian in style. The spring bedding is in a free, relaxed, painterly manner with large intermingling drifts of tulips and scented wallflowers underplanted in a mass of forget-me-nots and violets in blue and white, with early rhododendrons flowering in giant lemon pots. This painterly quality was almost certainly derived directly from Alfred Parsons' gardening style. And it's worth remembering that William Robinson, the great proponent and publicist of a quasi-wild style of planting in gardens, actually consulted Parsons' advice on planting in his own home, Gravetye Manor. An early example of Parsons' work was the garden for Percy Wyndham's Clouds in Wiltshire, the house built in 1886 by architect Philip Webb, a great social hub in its day, associated with the aesthetic-minded group The Souls, which included Winifred, Duchess of Portland. At Clouds, there was a similarly relaxed planting of spring bulbs in a framework of clipped yews, an arts and crafts marriage of old and new. Here we see one of the east terraces in early summer, planted with a remarkable display of Campanula pyramidalis, underplanted with tall pink antirrhinums, and in the foreground, a low-growing delphinium, a kind of larkspur. We just catch a glimpse of the ornamental pool on the right, with pots, great pots of agapanthus brought into bloom early for that particular display. Moving into early summer, we come to the sunken garden. And this is a remarkable area, which was the intended site of a bachelor's wing, which was underway at the fifth Duke's death and then abandoned, leaving this great chasm to be further developed. Now, the layout of the sunken garden, or Duchess's garden in this cellar area, was first proposed in 1909 by Alfred Parsons, who originally called it the Latomia Garden in a reference to the famous ancient Sicilian limestone quarries and caves at Syracuse, which now appear as verdant gardens. As ideas for the sunken garden were developed, Harold Peter of Eyford Manor and architect Sir Ernest George were consulted. A member of the estate staff also made significant contributions. Harold Peter's proposals of 1909 included waterworks, 4 domed temples, and a colonnade. These improvements were not accepted, but Sir Ernest George's design for the large north summer house was accepted. The Duchess writing on the plan, "I approve this very much." Alfred Parsons' central feature of a long canal with 2 large semicircular terminations was modified into 2 separate pools surrounded by a grand stone and timber pergola, which spans a broad stone-flagged path. The centerpiece became a hard tennis court concealed by high clipped yew hedges. The design was completed by a small southern summer house, its roof supported by caryatids and by sculptures, an antique wellhead and various topiary birds and ornaments. Work on the hard landscaping construction of the garden continued at least until 1914 and almost certainly beyond. In all, it is a perfect late expression of the arts and crafts style that continued to be developed and immaculately maintained during the 1920s and 30s. Stephen Pegler's photographs show it in magnificent maturity in the mid to late 20s. In a style, its arts and crafts manner was already old-fashioned, but the design is deeply romantic and extraordinarily successful. Everywhere, roses cascade from the pergola, and prismatic colors are provided by the underplanting of summer flowering herbaceous plants. Here is an earlier photograph showing the pergola, and the rose is not quite up to the top of the columns, but it shows the brilliance and the variety of the planting, and everywhere you see flowers, flowers, flowers everywhere. Moving to high and late summer, we come to the double herbaceous borders, which are the climax of the Abbey flower gardens. This double border was reached from the east terraces and laid out on a north-south axis between two lines of small-leaved limes that were probably already about 100 years old. Interrupted at its midpoint by an old Venetian fountain with an attendant group of golden Irish yews, it was concluded at its far end by a painted and gilded curved iron clairvoyant. Another incident was provided by a pair of vases brought from Huntsville and Bentinck, 1st Earl of Portland's gardens near The Hague at Zorgvliet. Zorgvliet meaning carefree or sans souci. Here we can begin to consider some statistics. Each of these parallel borders is approximately 15 feet wide, and each is 1 furlong long, or 660 feet. The total length of the borders taken together is therefore a prodigious 1/4 mile. Although it's difficult to calculate the number of individual plants to a square yard, some plants large, some very small, I think it likely that at least 20,000 plants would be required to achieve the effect we see in these photographs. We might also consider that the border display would be at its height for a relatively short season, but this was not apparently so. Contemporary article in the Gardener's Chronicle reports that the borders remained in show condition until well into September. This suggests that a large stock of flowering plants was kept in reserve, perhaps subjected to the Chelsea chop to delay flowering to a later than normal season, as well as others raised under glass to bring them forward. So as one group faded, new plants could be brought from the reserve to reinvigorate the display. The borders must have needed constant work to maintain their appearance. We see here that the standard of cultivation is supremely good, plants in robust health, invisibly supported. That's not quite true. If we look carefully at the hollyhocks, we see that each one is tied to a perfectly vertical stake, I'm sure checked with a spirit level. The horticultural professionalism is extraordinary. And the sheer amount of labor, number of gardeners, and time required to plant and maintain such a display is equally extraordinary. It must have required an absolute army, subject to firm discipline, an army with a perfect sense of timing. All of this is all very well, but what must strike us from these photographs is the wonderful artistic effect of the borders and a style suggesting that the garden designer Nora Lindsay almost certainly influenced the planting. Nora Burke, 10 years younger than Duchess Winifred Portland, in 1895 married Sir Harry Lindsay, younger brother of Duchess Winifred's friend Violet Manners, Marchioness of Granby and later Duchess of Rutland. The couple's wedding present was Sutton Courtenay Manor in Oxfordshire, where Nora Lindsay immediately began to display her talent as a gardener of originality and sensibility. A talent which in later life she put to good professional use out of financial necessity following the failure of her marriage. A close friend of Duchess Winifred's, she was regularly at Welbeck. I believe the exuberance of this planting was guided by her, and the sheer nerve of some of the juxtapositions of big, generous patches of colour was hers. Who else would think of putting mustard yellow goldenrod against double sugar pink hollyhocks, of scarlet against pink border flocks, of pink against orange? The secret of the design lies in the great masses of white, ivory, and pale cream. Quite half the planting is an almost colourless matrix which separates and moderates the other flashing, clashing, bright colours. The overall effect is opalescent, just like a pale, milky opal gemstone, which when turned in the light emits sparks of bright complementary colours. And although the repertoire of plants is quite restricted, the patterns cleverly do not exactly repeat. So an effect of constant variety is created. I'm particularly interested to see this group of the white Japanese lily, Lilium speciosum album here, underplanted with a white viola, probably Viola cornuta. At first, this seemed a little unlikely, but in the second half of the 19th century, Japanese nurserymen, encouraged by European businessmen, were raising quantities of such bulbs for the Western market. And these were advertised in fine catalogues illustrated by exquisite hand-cut polychrome woodcuts. There was also the 1910 Japanese-British exhibition held at White City in West London. And there were two large Japanese gardens constructed by Japanese gardeners that created a furore and a tremendous enthusiasm amongst gardeners for all things Japanese. And it explains why we find these Japanese plants. And there are the mustard yellow golden rods and pink hollyhocks again, but all moderated by the white. Again, we see the white playing its important part in this cross view, where the masses of white and ivory moderate the effects of brilliant colors. This masterwork could not last. Come 1914, the army of gardeners went to war. The borders were stripped out and planted with potatoes. They were never restored. Stephen Pegler's photographs are the memorial, and a memorial to past times when things were done differently. I'm ending with a view taken from the East Terraces looking along the Great Lake, the centerpiece of Francis Richardson's great landscape garden of the 1740s and 50s, with ancient woodlands and Duchess Winifred Portland's flower gardens set like jewels around the great house.